I was 22 years old when my stepfather changed the locks and left my suitcase on the porch. Not on the sidewalk, on the porch. Like he wanted me to know exactly how close I'd come to still having a home, just not close enough. I stood there in November, in Georgia, in a hoodie that wasn't warm enough for the temperature, staring at 2 suitcases and a garbage bag full of books I'd collected since I was a kid. My mom's car wasn't in the driveway. She'd known this was coming, and she'd made sure not to be there when it happened. That told me everything I needed to know about which direction her loyalty ran. I had $412 in my checking account. A part-time job at a copy center that paid me $11 an hour, and a best friend, Becca, who was already living 4 to a 2-bedroom apartment in Marietta, and couldn't take me in no matter how badly she wanted to. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what it feels like, to be standing outside a door that used to be yours, counting money in your head, doing the math over and over, because you keep hoping the numbers will change. They don't. They never do. I spent the first 2 nights in my car. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd figure it out. I drove to work both mornings and used the bathroom there to wash my face and brush my teeth. And I smiled at customers and helped them with their print orders, and nobody knew. That's the thing about falling apart at 22. You can still make it look like you're holding together. You've got enough youth left to fake it. On the 3rd day, I called my Aunt Ruth, who lived 45 minutes east in a small town called Delwood. I hadn't talked to her in almost 2 years. We'd drifted after my grandfather passed, the way families do when the person holding them together is suddenly gone. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "I know," she said, before I'd finished explaining. "Your mother called me." I didn't say anything for a moment. "She did?" "She called to tell me not to give you money." Ruth paused. "I'm going to ignore that. She wired me $200 and told me to come stay with her for a few days while I sorted things out." I loaded my suitcases back into my trunk and drove east on I-20, and somewhere on that drive between the Atlanta sprawl and the pine trees of Delwood, something in me went very quiet, not the bad kind of quiet. The kind that comes when you've stopped fighting the current and started figuring out which direction the water's actually flowing. Ruth's house was warm and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. She fed me chicken and rice and didn't ask me any questions I didn't want to answer. She just let me sit at her kitchen table and breathe. It was on my 4th day there that she mentioned the Alderman place. "There's a piece of property that's been sitting empty out on Copperline Road," she said, refilling my mug. "Old farmhouse. Small. Nobody's touched it in years." She paused. "I heard they're trying to sell it off. Back taxes situation." I looked up. "How much?" Ruth shrugged, like the number was almost embarrassing to say. $20. I actually laughed. $20 for a house? $20 for whatever's left of one. The county just wants someone to take over the tax liability. She sat down across from me. "It's been empty a long time, Annie. People around here don't like to talk about it much." That was the part that should have made me pause. It didn't. When you're sleeping in your car, the word empty sounds an awful lot like the word available. Her name was Anna-Marie. Mine, I mean. Annie, to everyone who knew me. And Annie at 22, with $400 and nowhere to go, decided to drive out to Copperline Road and look at a farmhouse nobody wanted. The road was unpaved for the last quarter mile, cutting through scrub pine and red clay. The house sat back from the road maybe 100 feet, half hidden by a stand of old oaks, whose roots had started pulling up the front walkway. The porch sagged on one side. A window on the upper floor was cracked. The paint, what was left of it, was the faded gray-white of old teeth. I got out of my car and stood there for a long time. The property tax records, which Ruth had helped me find online the night before, said the house had last been occupied 11 years ago. Before that, a family named Hester had lived there for over 40 years. I didn't know anything about them yet. I just knew the house was still standing, and that was more than I'd expected. There was a man from the county waiting for me, Mr. Briggs, who'd agreed to meet me there after I called the tax assessor's office. He was in his 60s, wore a feed store cap, and shook my hand with the weary politeness of someone who didn't think I was going to follow through. "You sure about this?" he asked, after we'd walked through the downstairs together. The kitchen ceiling had water damage. The bathroom tile was cracked. The back door didn't latch properly. A bird had gotten in at some point and built a nest in the corner of the dining room. "What's the tax liability?" I asked. "Back taxes come to about $800. County'll let you pay it in installments if you're taking ownership." I looked around the dining room. Light came through the windows in long, dusty shafts. The floors were heart pine, warped in places, but solid. The bones were there. You could feel it, the way you can feel when something is tired but not finished. "I'm sure," I said. "Ruth lent me the first installment." I signed the paperwork 3 days later, and that was how I became the owner of a house everyone in Delwood seemed to go quiet about. I didn't notice it at first. The way people reacted when I mentioned the Hester place. I was too busy. I'd negotiated with my boss at the copy center to let me work remotely on some projects, and I spent my days driving back and forth between Ruth's house and Copperline Road with cleaning supplies and a box of tools I'd bought secondhand. I patched the back door. I cleared out the bird nest. I scrubbed 40 years of grime off those heart pine floors until my arms ached. But slowly, I started to notice. The man at the hardware store in Delwood, older guy, name tag said Walt, had handed me my bag of supplies and then said, almost to himself, "That's the Hester house you're fixing up?" "Yes, sir." He'd looked at me for a moment, then, "You be careful out there." I'd assumed he meant the structural stuff. Careful of the porch, careful of the wiring. I thanked him and left. The woman at the diner where I ate lunch sometimes, a sharp-eyed woman named Donna, who'd been there long enough to know everyone's business, asked me the same thing 2 days later. "You're the girl working on the Hester property?" "That's me." She refilled my coffee without me asking. Set the pot down. Didn't look at me when she said it. That house has been empty a long time for a reason. I waited for her to say more. She didn't. It was Ruth who finally told me, one evening when we were sitting on her back porch, watching the sun go down behind the pines. She'd been circling around it for days, I could tell. Ruth was not a superstitious woman. She was practical and clear-eyed, and had worked as a nurse for 30 years. But she held this particular story carefully, the way you hold something fragile you're not sure you should be carrying. The Hester family, mother, father, 2 daughters, had bought the Copperline Road property in the early 1970s. The father, Walter Hester, had worked at the mill. The mother, whose name was Cecile, had grown most of what they ate in the kitchen garden out back. By all accounts they were quiet, self-sufficient people who kept to themselves and meant no harm to anyone. In 1987, Walter Hester died. A stroke, sudden, at 53. The 2 daughters were already grown and gone by then, one to Atlanta, one to somewhere out west, nobody quite remembered. Cecile stayed. She lived alone in that house for 15 years after her husband died. People in town would see her at the grocery store, at church occasionally, at the hardware store buying things to keep the property up. She was said to be proud, and to not accept help easily. When neighbors offered, she'd thank them and decline. In 2002, a bad winter, ice storms. Power out for 8 days across half of Putnam County. When the power came back on and someone finally drove out to check on Cecile Hester, they found her at the kitchen table. She'd been gone for several days. The coroner said it was hypothermia complicated by a heart condition she'd apparently known about and not told anyone. She'd been there, alone in that house, and nobody had known to come sooner. After that, the daughters came back to settle the estate. They took what they wanted and left. Neither of them could bear to sell the place, and neither of them could bear to keep it, so they did nothing. The property taxes went unpaid year after year until the county moved to seize it, and the house sat empty, and people in Delwood drove past it on Copperline Road and felt whatever it is you feel when you pass a place where someone died alone. Guilty, maybe, or just sad, or that particular kind of uncomfortable that comes from knowing a community failed someone and not knowing what to do about it afterward. That was the story of the Hester house. Not a curse, a grief. I sat with that for a long time after Ruth finished telling me. How many people knew she was out there struggling? I finally asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Enough, she said. Enough that it stayed with people. I nodded. I looked out at the pine trees. I thought about Cecile Hester sitting at her kitchen table in the cold, too proud to ask for help, and a community too uncertain to push past her refusals. I thought about my own mother, who'd called Ruth to tell her not to help me. I thought about all the ways people find to look away from each other. "I'm going to fix the house," I said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't really directed at Ruth. It was just me saying something out loud to make it real. The thing about fixing a house is that it teaches you things you didn't know you needed to learn. I'd grown up in suburbs. I knew nothing about plumbing. I knew nothing about electrical work. I knew nothing about why a floor joists, or how to repoint a chimney, or what it means when a wall feels soft when you press your hand against it. I learned. Slowly, badly at first, and then better. I watched videos at night at Ruth's kitchen table. I asked Walt at the hardware store questions I was embarrassed not to know the answers to, and he answered them without making me feel embarrassed, which is a kindness I haven't forgotten. I found a retired contractor named Hugh Bealey, who lived 2 roads over, and he came by one afternoon to look at the porch and stayed for 3 hours, walking me through what needed to be done and in what order. "You're doing the right thing here," he said, at the end of that first afternoon. He was looking at the house, not at me when he said it. "The repairs?" He made a small sound. That too. I stayed at Ruth's for the first month, driving out to Copperline Road every day. Then I moved into the house itself, which was probably premature, but I couldn't stand the commute anymore, and besides, the downstairs was livable by then. I set up an air mattress in what I was starting to think of as the living room. I brought my books from the garbage bag and arranged them along the mantelpiece because there were no shelves yet, and they needed somewhere to be. The kitchen garden out back was completely overgrown, but the bones of it were there, the old raised beds, stone-edged, and the remains of a wire fence that had kept rabbits out. I started clearing it in the early mornings before the heat came. Georgia in December is cold enough to be unpleasant, but not cold enough to stop you, and I found I liked those hours in the garden, before the day really started. Just me and the red clay, and the sound of the pines. In one of the beds, under about 4 inches of packed soil and dead vegetation, I found a coffee can. I thought it was trash at first. But when I pulled it out and pried off the lid, it wasn't trash. It was a collection of seed packets, wrapped in a cloth and secured with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. The packets were old, the paper fragile, the printing faded, but they were intact. Tomatoes, string beans, okra, something called mortgage lifter that I later learned was a heritage variety of tomato. Cecile Hester had almost certainly grown herself from saved seed. There was also a folded piece of paper. I sat down right there in the garden bed, with clay on my knees and the December sun low in the sky, and I unfolded it. It was a letter, or the beginning of one. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind of handwriting that comes from learning in an era when penmanship was still taught. It was undated. "If you find this, it started. I suppose that means I'm gone, and the garden is gone, and probably a lot else besides. I want you to know that things grew here, really grew. I want you to know that this ground is good." That was all. It ended there, mid-thought, as if Cecile had meant to come back to it and hadn't. I sat in that garden for a long time. I didn't tell anyone about the letter right away. I kept it in the tin on the mantelpiece next to my books, and I thought about it while I worked. While I patched drywall and sanded floors and figured out why the kitchen faucet had developed a drip. I thought about a woman writing a letter to an unknown future person, wanting them to know that things had grown here, that the ground was good, leaving that knowledge behind like a gift, just in case. It was Walt at the hardware store who connected me with the Hester daughters. I'd asked him, carefully, if he knew what had happened to the family. He'd given me a considering look, and then told me that the older daughter, Patricia Hester, now Patricia Morse, lived in Eatonton, maybe 25 minutes away. She'd come back to the area after her retirement, he said. He didn't have her number, but he knew someone who did. I debated whether to reach out for a week. I didn't want to cause pain. I didn't know if Patricia Morse wanted to hear from the woman who'd bought her childhood home for $20 in back taxes. I finally wrote her a letter, actual paper pen, because it seemed like the right medium for what I wanted to say. I told her who I was and what I was doing with the house. I told her I'd found the seed packets and the unfinished letter in the garden. She called me 4 days later. Her voice was careful at first, measured. She'd been a retired school administrator, I later found out, and she had the voice of someone who had decades navigating delicate conversation professionally. She asked about the house. I described the repairs I'd made. She was quiet for a moment when I mentioned the porch. "Mama was always after Daddy to fix that porch," she said, And then, I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. Don't apologize, I said. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. She told me things about the house I hadn't known. Where the studs were in the tricky south wall, why the upstairs bathroom light flickered. Something to do with a repair her father had done in 1979 that was technically functional, but not quite right. What her mother had planted in each bed of the garden. She told me that Cecile had tried to sell seed packets at the farmer's market in Milledgeville in the late 90s, and that people had driven an hour to buy the mortgage lifters. Because they were the best-tasting tomatoes in Middle Georgia. At the end of the call, she said, I should have gone back more. After she died, I mean. I should have gone to the house and done something with it, instead of just leaving it. You came back, I said. Too late. Maybe, I said. But you're on the phone right now. Patricia came to see the house in late January, on a Saturday when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the pines were dripping from an overnight rain. She drove a sensible silver sedan, and wore a rain jacket and good boots, and she stood at the edge of the property for a long moment before she walked toward me. She was 71 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been strong her whole life, and was now deciding what to do with all that strength in the years she had left. I recognized that look. I was starting to see it in myself in the mirror, which was strange at 22, but not, I thought, surprising. I showed her everything. The floors I'd refinished, the kitchen with its new faucet and its scrubbed tile, and the window above the sink that I'd resealed so it didn't rattle in the wind anymore. The back porch where I'd rebuilt the rotting boards. The garden. She stood in the garden for a long time. It was still mostly bare. It was January, but I'd cleared it properly now, and the stone-edged beds were visible again, and you could see what it had been. She loved this garden, Patricia said. When we were kids, we'd be out here every summer morning. She knew every plant by name and then some. She'd talk to them. She paused. I thought that was embarrassing when I was young. I think about it differently now. I showed her the coffee can, the seed packets, and the letter. I watched her face when she read it. I won't describe what happened to her expression because it doesn't belong to me to describe, but she held the letter for a long time, and when she finally set it down, she looked at the garden, and then at me and said quietly, "She would have liked you." I had to look away. We stood in the garden in the January cold, and I told her what I was planning. The seeds. The mortgage lifters especially. I'd already reached out to a heritage seed organization at the University of Georgia Extension Office. They were interested in cultivating the variety, in preserving it. I would plant a portion of the garden this spring and donate seeds to the program. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. "You've been busy," she said. "I've had time," I said. She almost smiled at that, and then she did smile, the full version, and it transformed her face, and I could see the girl she'd been, running out into this garden on summer mornings while her mother talked to the tomatoes. "Can I come back in the spring?" she asked. "When things are growing." "I'd like that," I said. What I know now that I didn't know then is that houses remember things. Not in the haunted house way people sometimes mean. Not ghosts, not anything you could point to. More like the way a person remembers a loss. Quietly, in the background, structurally. The Hester house had been holding something for 11 years, sitting out on Copperline Road with its sagging porch and its cracked window, waiting for someone to come and let it start again. I am not a poetic person by nature. I'm practical. I like things to make sense. But I spent 6 months in that house, fixing it board by board and tile by tile, and by the time the mortgage lifters came up in June, tall and sprawling and improbably red, exactly as Patricia had described them, I understood something I couldn't have explained to you on that November afternoon when I was standing outside a locked door with $400 and nowhere to go. Some things can only be found in the places everyone else has given up on. My rent-to-own agreement with myself, the back taxes paid in installments, Ruth's $200 repaid, a small loan from the SBA for the structural repairs, was nearly settled by midsummer. The copy center job had evolved into remote graphic design work, which I did at the kitchen table in the mornings before the garden needed tending. I'd stopped sleeping on the air mattress. I had a real bed now, in the upstairs room that had been Cecile's, facing east toward the pines. Patricia came back in June, as she'd said she would. She brought her younger sister Helen this time, the one who'd gone west, who'd ended up in Portland and hadn't been back to Delwood in more than 20 years. Helen was smaller than Patricia and quieter, and she walked into the garden and stopped and didn't say anything for a long time. "She saved those seeds," Helen finally said. "For whoever came next," I said. Helen looked at me then. "You didn't have to do this, reach out to us. You didn't have to tell us." "I know," I said. "Why did you?" I thought about it. I thought about the letter in the coffee can, and about the unfinished sentence, and about what it means to leave something behind for someone you'll never meet. I thought about Cecile Hester at her kitchen table, alone in the cold, in a house full of things she'd grown and built and tended. I thought about a community that hadn't pushed hard enough, and the weight of that regret that had settled over this piece of road for 11 years. "Because it was hers to know," I said. "What happened here, that it's still happening." Patricia had brought a casserole dish covered in foil. Helen had brought wine. We ate in the kitchen with the windows open, and the smell of the garden coming in on the evening air, and Helen told stories about their childhood I hadn't heard, and I told them things I'd found in the house. A child's drawing tucked behind a radiator, a row of dated marks on the doorframe, where children's heights had been recorded, and it felt, in some way I'm still not sure I can fully explain, like a conversation that had been waiting to happen for a very long time. The Extension Office's Heritage Variety program planted their first row of mortgage lifters that same summer. They named the cultivar Hester's Ridge. Patricia cried when they called to tell her, and she called me right after, still crying a little, and told me she didn't cry at things usually. And I told her that was okay. That seemed like a thing worth crying about. Walt at the hardware store stopped treating me like a question mark sometime around April. He started just talking to me when I came in. Real conversation, his opinions about the weather and county politics, and which brand of wood filler actually held up. Donna at the diner started putting in my order when she saw my car pull into the lot. Ruth came for Sunday dinners, which became a thing that happened without anyone deciding it would. I'm not telling you things turned out perfectly. The house still needed work. It always needs work. My relationship with my mother remained what it was, which is to say complicated and painful in ways I'm still figuring out. The SBA loan had 18 months left on it as of the time I'm writing this. I was not rescued. I did not meet someone who fixed everything. I fixed things, slowly and badly at first and then better. But I want to tell you about the morning I found the coffee can, because I think about it often and I haven't fully told it yet. It was early December. I'd been at Copperline Road for less than 2 weeks. Everything was still a mess, and I wasn't sure yet what I was doing, or whether this was a terrible mistake or a necessary one. The clay was cold on my knees, and the sun was low, and I was in a garden bed pulling up dead roots, and I dug up a coffee can that a woman I never met had buried there, probably sometime in the 1990s, probably just to keep things safe. And inside it was evidence that something had grown here. Evidence she'd wanted someone to know. That moment, my hands cold, the clay under my fingernails, that fragile paper in my hands, that was the moment I stopped feeling like someone things were happening to, and we started feeling like someone who was in a place, doing something, on purpose, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what the ground needed. I still have the letter. I keep it in the tin on the mantelpiece, next to my books. Patricia asked if she could have a copy, and I made her one on the good paper at the copy center. I keep the original. "Things grew here," Cecile Hester wrote. "This ground is good. She was right, and now she knows someone else knows it too.